Okay, well, welcome to the latest. I've lost count of how many of these we've done. The latest talk about how things are going with the COVID-19 pandemic. The last one of these was right at the end of October. We do them about once a month now, towards the end or beginning of the month. Most of these data will be from Thursday, actually, the Thursday download of data. So I'll go through a lot of the similar things I do every month, an overall view of the outbreaks and how new case growth is changing across regions. Then looking at countries and the global model of some of the countries' outbreak models, as well as regionally, and also some other interesting outbreaks looking at individual country models. And then a similar look at the US broken down by states and some of the states models, as well as nodal outbreaks among states. And then looking at California, the 30 largest outbreaks among California counties and the resulting some of the counties model, and then a little more detailed look locally around Santa Barbara and our neighboring counties. And then look a couple of the things I usually look at variants and vaccines in terms of progress on vaccinations, as well as the emergence of variants, and then a couple charts specifically around Omicron and kind of what makes it different and why is it getting so much attention when we just found it 27 days ago, things like that. Start with, in summary, globally we're seeing cases rise again. So the last month they've been pretty flat, 400 to 450,000 new cases a day typically, and they've been rising over the last month. They actually started rising a little over a month ago and are getting close to the 750,000 a day level we saw in August. So globally, there are more cases happening now than there were a month ago every day. Many resurgences, though, have declined a lot. Southeast Asia, South Asia, that have had very large outbreaks this year continue to go down. Europe, on the other hand, is really the epicenter right now of the case growth. And I'll show that on the regional graph. And some other places. Vietnam has turned around to be surging again and seeing a lot of case growth. So there, as always, are, in almost every region you're going to find outbreaks that are both going down and then some that are going up steeply. The variants continue to emerge, and the latest that is very famous all of a sudden is Omicron. There are reasons for that I'll show. It is the first really to show signs that it could potentially displace Delta. And I'll show some of those data, but it's really, really early. Part of my consistent message will be the celebrity of the variant is outpacing what we know about it right now. Vaccinations continue to grow. So last month, we talked about 25 million doses a day being administered globally, and it's up to about 35 million doses a day now. A lot of the Western countries are seeing daily doses decline. In the US, they're actually going up. They're not as high as they were in April, but they have been rising since about July. As has been true, some of the highly vaccinated cases can still see high per capita new cases, but in general do not see that same phenomenon with fatalities. So starting at the world view, these are, as I mentioned, all data from the Johns Hopkins database taken December 2nd, so Thursday. And this is the view of all the outbreaks by size and time. These are the pseudo-logarithmic scale from outbreaks of 100 cases to outbreaks over 20 million cases. There's been moderate growth in the large outbreaks over the last month, so there have been a number of outbreaks that have crossed some of these thresholds. As has been the same for months, there's no new outbreaks over at the small stages, so no new outbreaks greater than 100 since July. So basically, there aren't places that haven't had COVID, or if there are, they still don't. There's been, for most of the moderate-sized outbreaks, say less than 1 million cases, that have been pretty small growth in the number of those outbreaks, about a 5% increase in the last 30 days. 10 to 20% growth in the number between 1 and 2 million in the last 30 days. some more growth greater than 5 million, about 20% growth in outbreaks greater than 5 million. So some of the larger outbreaks have continued to see significant case growth. And after going for quite a few months with sort of this gap where we have these three big outbreaks that are over 20 million in the US, India, and Brazil, and then nothing between 10 and 20 million, the UK, after having a number of months, you'll see on the graph, of pretty significantly high daily new cases, has exceeded 10 million cases now. And in terms of the 50 largest outbreaks, they're the same, with the exception that Lebanon dropped out and Slovakia came in. You'll see Slovakia's graph. They've had a significant surge that looks to be peaking, but in the last month, they've you can see where they are all the way up here, from having been not among the 50 largest outbreaks last month to being 40th or wherever they are right now, is a lot of case growth. That's true of many of the outbreaks in Europe. This is the regional breakdown over the course of the pandemic. So the fraction of global daily new cases by region. Here at the current time, you can see the dark blue here for Western Europe had a lot of growth in share over the last month. So that is where a lot of the case growth has been coming. Northern Europe has been, pretty stable. Eastern Europe even down slightly. Southern Europe has grown a little bit. But when you add all those together, about 62% of the cases over the last 14 days globally came in Europe, of the new cases, which is a very big fraction. I think the last time we saw one region, and that's a pretty big region, one region account for that kind of a share of cases was when India was really surging, and South Asia accounted for more than half the global daily new cases. So there definitely is a lot of case growth in Europe, and that's been driving a lot of the global case growth as it's gone up and exceeded 600,000 cases a day here in the last month. North America's been pretty flat. I think we were 17% last month. We're 16% this month. And other than that, Europe and North America, all the other regions are under 10. And in fact, most are under 5% of the global cases. So if we translate that to new cases per million population over the last week, and then sort that into quartiles, this map illustrates that. So the top quartile of countries, in terms of the countries that have the biggest per capita new cases in the last month, this month is above 1,600, which is close to where it was last month. All these quartiles actually are pretty similar to where they were last month. The third quartile is from 340 to 1,600, and then 32 to 380, and then the bottom quartile this month is under 32. Last month it was under 30, but we have a little bit more case growth this month. The notable changes, an interesting change I didn't expect, is that Greenland is red. So Greenland is among the countries in the top quartile with the highest per capita case growth. Greenland landed there because they had 250 cases in the last week. So it doesn't take a whole lot of cases for Greenland to be red. I'm not sure how long they'll stay red. But Norway also, which hadn't been red before, moved into the top quartile this month. And a couple places in Eastern Europe, moved from the top to the third quartile. Russia, for example, was red last month and they're orange this month. They went from kind of the lower end of red to the upper end of orange, but they're orange. Poland became red. They had been orange. Most of Central Africa, most of Africa overall, is in the bottom quartile. China has remained green. South Asia remains pretty much the same. So there haven't been a whole lot of changes except those that I pointed out. I don't think anybody jumped 2 quartiles. Some places are going down, but the main region where we see a lot of per capita case growth is in Europe. So I'll move on to the country models. These are the R-squareds of the models, so they remain kind of like they have been. Kazakhstan's fatality issues continue to occur, I'll say, and that's why they keep getting called out. For example, Turkey had a very, very big data issue in their case data months ago. But over time, if the data are consistent, the R-squared recovers. But in the Kazakhstan fatality data, it doesn't, because the issues have been recurring. So looking at the cumulative cases, we see this sort of linear rise with waves that we can see better in the derivative graph for the daily new cases. This is the US continuing to go up. India, you can see really flattening out. You'll see India's new cases have gotten quite low. And they've been going down for 7 months now, quite a long time. In the US, we have not experienced 7 months decline in cases. Brazil, similarly, is becoming pretty flat, getting pretty low levels of new cases. Other places, France, Germany, and Europe, they're going up. You can see there's this concave upward. These are the same models and the same data, but looking at the daily new cases, you can see those have been going up since about the end of December. This looked relatively flat last month, but you can see over the last 30 days, it's really conclusively resurging in the number of daily new cases. And I guess one other comment, we'll see this on a lot of these graphs, is that, well, two things. First of all, I really need to add a sixth outbreak now to the models. I didn't do that for this month. As it appears, we're beginning in a lot of places to have yet another resurgence. Places that already had 5 very distinct outbreaks are beginning to get resurgences. And some of the FITs are not describing the outbreaks well without adding a sixth outbreak set of terms. But these are all managed to fit well. But sometimes the little upticks at the end that accumulate, if you ignore all those, or if the model doesn't pick up on all those for a bunch of countries, then you'll miss the overall global trend, at least in the model. But in this case, with the 5 outbreak models, it's sufficient to find the resurgence. These are fatalities, which you can see still pretty concave downward, pretty much in all the outbreaks, really, except Russia even is a little bit turned over. And you can see in the actual fatality data, it's really pretty flat. It's been pretty flat for essentially October and November. The models all have it coming down. And this is an example of the sort of accumulated upturns at the ends of models, or in some cases, as you'll see in some of the US data, that flattening out, leveling out, sort of stagnating at the fatality rates. We can see that even in the level of Santa Barbara, that we've had a very flat rate of new fatalities even as cases came down. So the 5 largest outbreaks are the same as last month. The US, India, Brazil, the UK, and Russia were the same 5 in the same order as last month. Brazil and India, as I mentioned, have seen declining cases for more than 5 months. In India's case, really, it's more than 7 months, and are getting down to relatively low numbers of cases. You can see Brazil here at 10,000 cases a day, which a year and a half ago would have seemed like a lot, but now it seems like not so many. The US, you can see after coming down from August, we've started to have sort of an erratic increase in cases. Just like the UK, you can see the UK as this kind of bouncing around erratic case growth. It goes up and down a little bit, but the overall trend is clearly increasing the average daily new cases. And that's been happening for a number of months in the UK. It's really just been a couple months in the US. And Russia, after reaching a new peak pretty much right around the end of October, it looks like it's starting to come down now, as you saw on the world map. It entitled it to become orange instead of being red last month. So among these outbreaks, you can see there's a lot of variance in the behavior, from some that are coming down and have been coming down a long time to some that are just coming down and some that are still going up. And as I've said a couple times already, the resurgence in Europe is really very broad, and you can see it pretty dramatically on some of these graphs. So these are pretty much put down here in order of overall outbreak size. So the UK, we saw in the first chart for this section. France is the next largest outbreak. You can see dramatically rapid increase in daily new cases that's happened really since the first week or so in November. Germany continues to have a lot of case growth and is at all-time record numbers of daily new cases, higher than they've seen at all during the pandemic so far. Spain has turned up pretty rapidly. Belgium has reached new peaks. Same with the Netherlands. Italy, which had one of the most severe outbreaks very early in the pandemic, is now also seeing a lot of case growth. So you can see why all the red and orange in Europe and the 62% of the daily new cases over the last 2 weeks have been in Europe. There's just almost across the board, the outbreaks are all going up a lot. In Latin America, for the most part, and if you remember from the last month, it was about the first month where it wasn't two of them are going down and one of them's going up. Last month, pretty much everything looked under control. Chile looked like it might be turning up a little bit, and it did, in fact, turn up and have kind of a small resurgence that looks now like it's peaked down here in the bottom right. The rest of them are way down from their most recent peaks, but they all have a bit of this, the kind of thing I was mentioning earlier. Looks like it's turning up. It's certainly not going down anymore. It's looking flat to slightly up. Peru is definitely going up a little bit, and you'll see this in a lot of the graphs. Things aren't just going down, they're sort of flattening or turning up a little bit. And when we look at that at a lot of different levels, my interpretation is there's some degree of likelihood that that'll lead to continued case growth globally, like we've seen over the last month. In Central and Western Asia, Turkey, has really been stuck at the 20 to 30,000 cases a day level for several months. It may be peaking, but it kind of has looked like that each month of the last 3 months, but it just is stuck at this level of transmission. And I think from just the disease transmission point of view, if you have a flat number of daily new cases, then that's only stable at a point. It's really a metastable condition, because if things get a little bit worse, they'll start going up, and that'll have a concave upward nature to it, or it'll start going down. But it's not very stable to have a flat number of new cases per day. The other outbreaks are pretty much all still going down. So other than Turkey being stable, the others are well below their peaks and continue to see declines in new cases rather than either stagnation or increases. In Eastern Europe, which really last month had the worst of the resurgences that we'd seen, we're seeing a lot more peaking. Some are still going up, but a lot more starting to peak or turn down. So Ukraine is down, approaching half where it was at its peak. Certainly the model fits. Poland is peaking. It's really a little bit early to call that. Same with Czechia. Romania is well down from its peak, a pretty small fraction of its peak. Serbia similarly is down. Slovakia, that was the new outbreak that was added to the 50 largest outbreaks this month. Model fits it as peaking, but it hasn't started going down yet. So that's pretty uncertain. There's more reduction in daily new cases in Eastern Europe than actually we're seeing in Western Europe. And so when we look at that as a region, it's slightly down in total compared to last month, whereas Western Europe is dramatically higher in terms of its daily new cases. And Eastern Europe by itself still is about 20% of the global daily new cases, so even more than North America. South Asia continues to decline. There isn't this sort of stagnation or turnaround that we're seeing in some of the other regions. It's really still declining in cases, just as we saw with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal all look very similar. From 60% of the world's cases in July to about 3% now is pretty dramatic progress. North Africa and the Middle East, pretty much all the large outbreaks there have declined a lot and have stayed down and continued to fall, except Jordan. Last month, I think I described it as one of these sort of stagnant, stuck at 1,000 cases a day, maybe a little upturn at the end, and then that has turned this month into a very clear increase in daily new cases that's leading to another surge. Southeast Asia, which of course just a couple months ago had a very broad, very rapid growth in new cases. They're pretty much all down now, under control. Malaysia, we're seeing, again, this sort of flattening, stagnation of the case declines. And in Vietnam, we're seeing a very, no question about it, big resurgence in Vietnam, where they're now at higher levels of daily new cases than they were at any other time in the pandemic. But outside of those two, other outbreaks are continuing to decline. A couple other outbreaks of interest. It's hard not just to have more European outbreaks, but I did pick three that weren't from Europe to add to this. One, Canada. Canada's, not surprisingly, looks a little reminiscent of the U.S., and it peaked up here in the late summer, early fall, came down, and now is kind of going up and either resurging or stabilizing, or kind of like many of the other outbreaks, stuck at this level of case growth. South Africa, which of course I'll talk more about the Omicron variant, but that's where the Omicron variant was first observed. It may not necessarily be where it first emerged, but it was where it was first observed, and is driving a lot of the case growth in South Africa, at least based on the sequences we have so far. And you can see that resurgence is starting up again in South Africa. And Japan, after whether it was the Olympics or not, it was pretty much temporarily coincident with the Olympics. After that big surge in the summer, is back to being very, very low in terms of daily new cases. And then these are three additional European outbreaks, Switzerland, Austria, and Hungary, that are both showing that same kind of behavior we're really seeing throughout most of Europe. Moving on to the U.S. state models, these are the R-squareds. They're not a big change from last month, nothing notable to point out there. So as always, I have models for all the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The sum of the states models predicts about 55 million cases for the U.S. and about 850,000 deaths. Those two numbers are very consistent with the current case fatality risk of about 1.6%. In terms of what changed from last month, the case prediction is about 10% higher. So last month it was 50 million and this month it's 55. The death prediction is actually about 15% lower. So last month, many of the models were fitting sort of a continued growth in daily new deaths, and now it's sort of fitting a peak there. The death prediction has gone down from 1 million to 850,000. We are seeing and I'll show the map, but we are seeing week over week case growth in most states, more than most, all but a few states, I'd say. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that map. These numbers are very consistent. So these are the sum of the states models. We're developing a series of individual models for each state based on those state data, add them up and see what it says about the country. It's very consistent with the individual country model, just modeling the data from the U.S. It has the same prediction, 55 million and 850,000. So over the last month, about 2.7 million more of the U.S. population, so that's about 0.8%, has been confirmed as a case in the last month. So that's about the same as last month, the previous month, which I think was about 0.7%. So a little bit higher, but really about the same, but about double the rate it was in July. As you can see from the graph, we're still seeing elevated rates of daily new cases compared to where we've been other times this year. About 4% of the population received the vaccine over the same period. So that's, I don't know exactly how important it is, but I like to see this ratio of these two numbers to be large. It would be nice if the number of people getting COVID in a month was a lot lower than the number of people getting vaccinated in a month. And so, it's about a fifth this month, which it hasn't been that low in a while. So this is a little bit higher than last month when it was 3%, but about half the rate it was 6 months ago when it peaked. And I'll have some graphs that show that. And so when I say 4% of the population received the vaccine, that's the increase in the number of people who have received at least one dose. So it doesn't mean that 4% of the people got boosters, but they're now 4% more of our population that has received at least one dose of vaccine. So this is the sum of the states models, and you can see this recent surge. There's been this linear growth period that looks like it's continuing when you add the state models up. The most concave upward surging, you'll see the colored lines are just the 10 largest state outbreaks. This is New York, this kind of goldenrod color. California, and in particular, Texas and Florida both have very low growth in cases. Some of the other places you'll see in the north central part of the U.S., for example, are seeing more dramatic increases in cases. And these are the daily cases, some of the states models. And this just looks really messy out here, this November new case growth. It's going up. It's certainly not going down. Is it sort of static, stable, stagnant, or is it really the sign of resurgence? We'll see. My sense is that there is a resurgence brewing that we can see when we look at the individual state data. The model, though, fits it kind of as a plateau, right? That's the dashed line, and not so much a resurgence. We'll see over the next month or two. These are fatalities, and you can see this is starting to be concave downward. There aren't really any jurisdictions where we're starting to see surges in fatalities, and the some of the models agrees fairly well. There's a little bit of a aberration with a high daily fatality spot here. And these are 7-day averages. So it's a lagging 7-day average. So there was some period of increased fatalities. I don't believe there was a data reporting issue that occurred here in the last week. So this sort of snapshot of the 7 cases that are contributing the most to the new cases we have in the U.S. These cases are a lot different, or these states rather, are a lot different than they've been previous months. And the color coding of the state information here also is a lot different for anybody who's memorized the previous versions of this chart. But what these 7 states are, these 7 states that contributed the most new cases in the last 14 days. Between mid-November and the 1st of December, these states contributed about 44% of the new cases. And last month, it was pretty much in balance. The 7 biggest cases, biggest states contributed a little more than a third of the new cases, and it represented a little more than a third of the population. Now they're coming up to representing close to half of the new cases, but they're still only about a third of the population. So these states are contributing more than their fair share of cases. And if the percent of the cases exceeds the percent of the population that state represents by more than 25%, then they get bolded and colored red. So last month it actually was Michigan, which at least for the last couple months hasn't even been on this list. And they accounted for a little over 8% of the new cases. They represent only about 3% of the population. So it's just under 3 times as many cases as you'd expect based on the population. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Minnesota all contributed more cases than would be expected based on their population, some significantly. Again, Minnesota is similar to Michigan, it's a little under 3 times as many. California is on here, and just mathematically, because of its large population, contributed a lot fewer cases than would be expected based on the population, and that it represents about 12% of the country's population, but only about 5% of the new cases. So this is different than it's been the last few months. Other interesting things, this graph also I've shown the last couple months. The most new cases per 10,000 population. So this isn't from October. This is from the 2 weeks before December 1st. I failed to edit those. But Michigan, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and New Mexico, these have changed fairly significantly in the last month, just like these have. Fewest new cases per 10,000, Florida, Hawaii, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia. And if you look at the map, and so these are just 5, but if I expand that out to the top 10, which states have the lowest per capita new case rate over the last 2 weeks, and make them green, and which 10 states have the highest per capita new case rate over the last 2 weeks and make them red. It clearly breaks out regionally, maybe a little more consolidated than last month, but not a really different look. So the places with the lowest case rates are pretty much the contiguous southeast corner of the U.S., almost without exception, from South Carolina to Texas and California. The places that have the highest per capita case growth, it's no longer Alaska, but it is a lot of the north central U.S., basically from North Dakota, all along the top of the country from North Dakota to Ohio, with Michigan having the highest, as well as Vermont, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, interestingly, and New Mexico. So with a little bit of scatter there, but those are the places where we're seeing the biggest per capita case growth and the lowest per capita case growth. And it's relatively consolidated regionally. And you can see here the graphs for these 7 states that are in the upper left-hand table. And you can see, most of them here have not really peaked yet. California, it's coming down. It's this one on the bottom left of this little cluster of graphs. But other than that, the rest of them have not begun declining in terms of daily new cases yet, which is another piece of data that makes me think that there's some resurgence percolating. And when we look broadly just at the question of, are states hitting new record highs in daily new cases, and are states experiencing week over week case growth? And that answer is yes, almost as strongly as it's been in the pandemic. So this month, this is the graph for this month, 41 states, including DC, had more cases in the last 7 days than the 7 days before that. That number was 17 last month, and this month it's 41. And we had 4 states hit a new high in daily cases: Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Michigan, versus no states that did so a month ago. And this is the graph from last month. Other than 10, I think it should be, because there actually are 51 things I keep track of. They're not all states because it includes the District of Columbia, but out of the 51, 41 had case growth week over week, and 4 of them hit a new high. What we're seeing in the case graph of kind of noisy increase or flattening, we're seeing at the state level is week over week case growth. So moving to the California county models, and last month I didn't have these because the model became corrupted, and I discovered it too late to fix it in time for the talk, but it's fixed now. And have the 30 largest outbreaks amongst California counties modeled for fatalities and cases. And as I always do, to call out places with consistently erratic data issues, and in this case at San Mateo and Shasta counties in California, that prove difficult to model because of the erratic data that they provide. So overall for California, state model predicts about 5 million cases and about 80,000 deaths. So both those numbers are slightly under 10% of what it's predicting for the country. Or that was 55 million and 850,000, which is a little bit less than our share. We're doing a little bit better than average, given that we're 12% of the population and we're less than 10% of the cases or fatalities in the overall prediction for the outbreak. Predictions have changed just slightly over the last few months, not a whole lot for California. This is the overall state model. You can see this sort of stagnation or this cessation of the decline of daily new cases that's happened over the last 6 weeks or so. And you can see the same thing in fatalities. Fatalities are just sort of stagnant at this level, say 100. And as I mentioned, you'll see that in Santa Barbara as well. As LA County goes, so goes California to a large extent, because it's about a quarter of the population. And you can see that the outbreak profiles for California as a whole and LA County, both in cases and fatalities, really track each other because of that. But I think we're not seeing the kind of resurgence like in many other states that were in that table, but we also are not seeing case declines like we're seeing in some other states, like Florida and Texas, for example. So this is the sum of the counties models. So these are the 10 largest county outbreaks. You can see they're flattening out in terms of cases. There's a little bit of departure here, as I pointed out, multiple places so far between the actual data and the models, where the actual data is actually getting a little bit worse than the models are fitting it to be. And you can see that here in the derivative model of daily new cases, that there's a little bit of divergence from the model fitting that things are going down, when really they're not quite going down. They're kind of going down a little or flattening. For fatalities, it's also a little bit of divergence, and you'll see it better on the next graph. San Diego is this line that's being fit with growth in daily new fatalities right now. You don't really see the departure of the model from the death data, but you also see this steady level of daily new deaths rather than declining level of daily new deaths that we want to see and we would kind of expect to see if the outbreak was declining. And the story is similar in Santa Barbara County. Daily new cases declined about half where they were in mid-August. They've stabilized at about 50 a day, plus or minus, for the last couple months. Haven't really gone down too much. And they haven't shot up. But as I mentioned, it's in this sort of metastable state of just a little bit of COVID, not even a little bit, just a medium amount of COVID that it would, in my opinion, would not be desirable to try and maintain. And it's similar with deaths. We're at 0.7 deaths a day on average last month. We're at 0.8 per day average this month. It's not meaningfully different, but it's also not as low as it has been in long stretches in between previous surges. It's still elevated and relatively flat. We did have a very big daily new case, highest since September, on Friday, just Friday, the day before yesterday, Friday. But it's just one data point, so it's no conclusions, and it kind of gets averaged out that you can't even really see it here. But it just is notable that it's significantly higher than pretty much anything in the last 2.5 months that we observed on Friday. So we'll see how that develops over the next few weeks. But it was a very notable peak daily, just a single day peak in new cases being reported. And it may be consistent with the positivity data. So after we peaked here, this in the bottom right is the testing positivity graph. And you can see it here really squished up against the edge of the chart. You can see that where we were hanging out here right around 3%, 3.5% from September and October and November. And really just since the last week in November to now, this testing positivity has risen to over 5%. So almost doubled in a couple of weeks. So it's another indicator that there may be more daily case increases coming. Hospitalizations, similar behavior to deaths. It's just pretty flat, stuck. It's gone down a little bit. And I think we got down to 24 hospitalizations at one point in the last month, which was lower than we'd been since end of July, maybe. But not anywhere near where we have been normally between surges. But they also haven't gone up. So been relatively flat, but still about 4 times where they were in June, for example. And no change in case fatality risk. If we look at the neighboring counties, they're pretty similar stories. Kern, which had a higher recent peak, is continuing to see declines, and we don't see as much evidence of turning up or flattening out as we do in Santa Barbara or Ventura or San Luis Obispo. Also, these jurisdictions have lower total levels of infection that have been experienced in the pandemic. Kern is almost 18% of the population of Kern County has been confirmed as a case, whereas in Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo and Ventura, it's more like 11 to 12. There was only about a 0.5% change from last month in terms of that, so it's below the number that we saw for the U.S. overall, but not as low as it has been in other times when we're not surging. Okay, talk a little bit about a variance, and some slides that you may be used to seeing I got rid of for this month because they didn't really change very much. Look at all the countries, they're all full of Delta. You look at what the CDC says, it says the US is mostly Delta. It's all Delta in terms of variance. To focus a little bit more on what we know and don't know about Omicron. So this is the standard next strain view of the phylogeny of variants for COVID. And the overall mutation rate is about the same as it's been, somewhere around 2 a month. It's also interesting to look at it. There's a chart you can print out from the same place for flu, for Ebola, for Zika virus, for all kinds of different viruses. They're all orders of magnitude lower in terms of the substitutions per month that are in the tree for the variants, primarily driven by both mutation rate as well as the number of cases and the overall number of viruses that are being reproduced globally is much, much larger for COVID. Delta, which is these blue and turquoise-ish areas here in this graph. So this graph is the global fraction of samples that are entered into this global influenza database. Just say the fraction over time that's entered that are attributed to one variant or another. And you can see as time went on, Beta came out in South Africa, Alpha primarily in the UK, Gamma in Brazil, Delta in India, and then Delta took over the world. And it's been that way for several months. For the first time, we're seeing a little sliver of something else displacing some of the Delta, and that something else is Omicron, and that's one of the reasons it's getting so much attention. Up here on the phylogeny tree, it's here. These red dots are the sequences of Omicron. So at least in terms of samples submitted to the GISAID database as of 11/29, Omicron was about 4% of global cases, which isn't a lot of global cases, but it's also only was first observed as of today, 27 days ago. So it's a fair number of cases. There may be some sampling bias that places that, because it has so much attention, places that find Omicron step up their sampling and submission of samples and data that may bias that fraction a little bit. But at any rate, there's Omicron around, and the more we look, the more we seem to find. And it is the first one, and again, it's really early, but is the first one to show signs that might be transmissible enough to displace Delta. I mean, it has displaced Delta in some outbreaks. Whether it will broadly displace Delta or not, I'm not sure. But this is the way it looks, and this is the first encroachment on Delta's predominance that we've seen since Delta emerged. The other synonyms for Omicron are 21K, that's the next strain clade that's been assigned, or the Pango lineage, it's B.1.1.529. So those are all synonymous to the same strain of variant. And one thing that's clearly notable about this is it has emerged into, I'm calling it celebrity, but it's in both the scientific and in the media in general. It is a very famous variant already, way faster than any variant that preceded it. And it's also very early in our process of really understanding it, from my take on what we know about it. The first sequence was from a specimen. I think the earliest one so far that I've seen or read about was a specimen in South Africa collected on November 8th. So, and again, that was 27 days ago. By the end of November, it was officially a variant of concern, both by the WHO and the CDC. Globally, Delta is still, as you saw on the previous chart, the predominant variant. Although Omicron has displaced it as the primary variant in South Africa and South Korea. I'll show some graphs, but again, it's very early days. South Africa it's a fair number of samples, but they had a relatively low rate of disease before Omicron emerged. So it's just early to make a declaration about how it's going to evolve as it goes around the world, which it's already doing. But also in South Korea, again, relatively small number of samples, but all the samples in the most recent publication from GISAID that came from South Korea were all Omicron. It's been detected both in travel-related and non-travel-related cases. So there's one level of concern, I guess, if somebody comes from South Africa and gets sick and you test them and they have Omicron. It's another if somebody in the community has Omicron, has no history of traveling to a place known to have Omicron, which implies there may be community transmission of that variant in the population, and that it may be harder to control than if it's just coming, if you can capture it from people that are traveling in. But it's over 20 countries now that have detected it in the US, and even as specifically as in California. It's got a lot of attention very quickly, and it's still just very new. So the current conclusions are that there really aren't any conclusions yet. There weren't any conclusions for Alpha or Delta 27 days after it was first identified either. So it's not surprising. But there are reasons that it's getting so much attention, and I'll go through a couple of those on the next couple of slides. There are reasons to infer it may be more transmissible, but it's really a little bit early to make that a conclusion. There are also reasons to infer it may have an impact on immune response and reduce the protection of immunity that's developed through vaccinations, for example. But there really aren't any data from which to draw a conclusion. So these are looking at the virus and making an inference rather than looking at data and making a conclusion. In terms of disease severity, there aren't really indications right now that the disease severity has increased. And if there were any indications right now in any direction, it would be that the disease is perhaps milder. Cases so far have been mild to moderate, but again, it's a little bit too early to conclude that is the case because it's a relatively small number of cases. A lot of the cases in South Africa were vaccinated. People who've been vaccinated, and cases are milder of all the forms of COVID if you've been vaccinated. And the cases were also predominantly among a younger cohort of patients who also typically experience more mild disease. So it's really too hard, too few cases, too little data to draw a conclusion. But I think there aren't any reasons to believe it's more severe, but it's a little early to conclude it's milder, although it could be. So if it's all too early, why is it getting all this attention? One of the clear reasons is the initial growth. In South Africa, there was a relatively rapid, big outbreak locally near Johannesburg. And when they started sequencing cases, it was all a new variant, and that variant turned out to be Omicron. When you look at what the covariance extracts, it's a nonprofit that extracts the data from GISAID and organizes it and tracks the progression of variants over countries and tracks the mutations among variants and things. Very useful clearinghouse for those kind of data. So that's where these graphs come from. So these are per variant graphs that show the percent of the cases that are represented by that variant for various countries. So all this mishmash of lines, colored lines here, are different countries. And so you can see with Delta, as we know, it kind of started to appear and percolate a little bit, and then all these lines shot up and it became the predominant variant in essentially all the outbreaks everywhere. But what we're seeing now, for the first time really since Delta emerged, is we've got a bunch of these lines that are starting to go down. So it means Delta's share is declining in a few places, not in most places by any means, but in a few places. So, but we haven't seen Delta prevalence going down like that since it emerged, really. And when we look at the corresponding Omicron graph, we can see Omicron is going up a lot in multiple places. And it's just a few places, and it's not a huge number of samples, and it's only been a few weeks. So it's really early to make a conclusion, as I repeated. But we haven't seen that. At least I can't find it in the data since Delta emerged. So it's different behavior than we've seen before since Delta emerged. There's actually some signs that could displace, signs that it has in some outbreaks displaced Delta to some degree, and in some cases really a significant degree. And if you look at that same GISAID graph that shows the progression of global share represented by these different variants, just for Africa, that's this bottom one, the one on the previous slide was globally. This is just Africa. And you can see that, it's a significant share. It's made a significant, in basically a month, made a pretty significant inroad into the share of infections that are coming from Omicron. Now, it's also on a continent that overall has a pretty low overall rate of infection. So it may be misleading to conclude that it's going to displace Delta in places where there are more significant levels of community transmission. But it's the first time we've seen signs of things, as I mentioned, that where there are a couple jurisdictions where Omicron looks like it may be something significant. So that's from what we see in terms of pandemic itself. What we see in the variant that is notably different is lots of spike protein mutations. Omicron has many more. I mean, it's not just like a bit more, about 4 times as many spike protein mutations as Delta. Many of those are in that region of the spike protein that are the receptor binding area where it interacts with cells and antibodies and things. So there are more differences in the area where those differences may result in differences in behavior or immune response or transmissibility. Omicron spike protein really the model just got resolved and published in the last week, at least on the covariance site. But you can see here, these are models of the tertiary structure of the spike protein for Delta and for Omicron. And each place there's a colored feature that's a mutation. And you can see there are just a lot more mutations on the Omicron spike protein than there are on the Delta spike protein. Do those all make a difference? Do they make it more evasive? Do they make it more transmissible? There are indications it might, but it's not really, there's no conclusion yet, as I mentioned. And when you look at just the number of spike protein mutations quantitatively, these are a bunch of the variants that have evolved over the course of the pandemic, from 19A, which was really the first Wuhan one, the next strain. Clade is the year. It's very simple. It's like 2019, the first one gets A, the second one gets B, and so on. 20, 21. Omicron is 21K, so it came out in 21, and it's the Kth one of them that got its own clade. So from 19A to 21K Omicron, and you can see the spike protein mutations kind of rose, and as 20A and 20E were the predominant strains in Europe when Europe had its 2020 large outbreak, when there were a lot of places in Europe experiencing growth in their pandemic, and that just had very few spike protein mutations. When we got into sort of the next generation of variants, here's Delta, which had 9. I think 21J actually has 12, but they're in the neighborhood of 9 to 12. Call it spike protein mutation. So up from 1 to 5 to 9 to 12. And Omicron, the defining mutations that are used to classify something as Omicron, there's 36. So it's just a significant change in the number. And because the spike protein determines a lot of the ways that the virus interacts with other cells, it has the potential to change the behavior a lot. And virus characteristics led to variants that have a lot of different behavior. Significant differences in behavior resulted from a lot fewer mutations. So, Delta has significantly different behavior than the other variants, and that occurred with 9 mutations. So it adds to the uncertainty about how big an impact that's going to have and which way it's going to make the behavior different. So that's Omicron. There is no Omicron so far in Santa Barbara. No Omicron sequences have been detected in Santa Barbara. Other variants being monitored or variants of concern have been. Delta has been dominant. It's been over 90% of the cases since July. It's actually under 90% of the cases in November, but there's a small number that have been sequenced in November, only about 35. But it's really, the current pandemic, as far as the cases we're sequencing being driven here, is Delta, and so far no Omicron case has been reported, although there has been one reported in California. And the other thing that was interesting in this month's data was that even as far back as February, the number of sequences reported at the public health department went up. There's even a longer lag, at least than I was aware of, in some of these things getting sequenced and the data getting back and getting recorded. So, it was all 9 months lag between submitting a sample and at least the data getting posted to the county public health website, which was longer than I expected. But a lot of the data gets posted within 6 to 8 weeks, I'd say, where the months at least have seemed pretty complete for a period of time. So we'll see more, as we get towards the end of December and into January of what November really looked like in terms of variants in Santa Barbara. All right, moving on to the last section, which is vaccines. This is the population for various countries receiving at least one dose. So what percent of the population has been vaccinated to any degree? And you can see UAE, which has been at a very high level of vaccination. Its population remains pretty high. Singapore, Cuba, which really rocketed up the charts and has remained high. China, which has also had a relatively later start, but and a huge job in terms of the number of people to vaccinate. They're significantly higher than we are in the U.S. Some of the places in Europe, it's hard to read, but France and Germany are in there. United Kingdom up here just above the U.S. And then the U.S. here in brown. The world is here. Globally, we're over half, which is remarkable, and remains really, to me, very, very remarkable achievement. all the difficulties in convincing people to do it and the misinformation and all that kind of stuff aside, just the accomplishment of our species to invent, make, distribute, and administer billions and billions of doses of vaccines all of a sudden is really pretty amazing. So globally, it's about 55% of the world's population has received at least one dose, and that's up 8% in October. So that's over 4 billion people now have been vaccinated. And its rate has increased to about 35 million doses a day. As we're aware, we started early and made a lot of good progress, and that's slowed. It's picking up a little bit more. I'll show you on the next graph or two about that. The other thing that remains an issue, of course, is the disparity in vaccine availability. So about 6.2% of the people in low-income countries have received a dose, but that's up from 2.3% last month. So there's definitely a trend in the right direction in terms of equity and in the availability of vaccines, but it's still a pretty significant difference, 10x, more than 10x for the US, for example. So here are two maps to illustrate kind of where we are with vaccination rates and progress to the sort of globally aligned target, which is to have 40% of the population in every country vaccinated by the end of the year. So the graph on the left is doses administered per 100 people, and you can see the scale here from light colors is not so many, dark colors is plenty. 260, that's fully vaccinated plus a lot of boosters. And you can see that in the Americas, relatively good distribution across the board of the vaccines. Of course, similarly in Europe, Eastern Europe, and some places in Western Asia, not as much. And Africa clearly behind everybody else. Fortunately, as far as the reported data, their case rates are relatively low, but so is their vaccination rate. So as things like Omicron emerge in Africa, it feels precarious to have such an under-vaccinated population compared to the rest of the world. In terms of being on track to the 40% vaccinated goal, all the green countries already reached it. The purple countries are on track to reach it, and the orange countries are not on track to reach it. So again, predominantly it's Africa that's not on track. A few places in Western Asia, Europe, a little bit in South Asia, Myanmar, I think, maybe driven by a lot of other social and political issues that are underway in Myanmar, and then Papua New Guinea also is not on track. But overall, a lot of the world is on track, and a lot of the world actually has already exceeded that goal. So looking at the U.S., percent vaccinated by state is this map on the left. So the darker blue colors are more vaccinated. There is a color assigned to 90% or more. There isn't a state, though, that gets that color yet. So I'm not sure why the CDC put that legend on the graph, optimistically, but there isn't a state that gets that color. But there are states that are up above 89. A state, New Hampshire, that's above 89% vaccinated. The lowest is Idaho, about 51% vaccinated. That means at least one dose. That range of getting close to 2 to 1 in terms of the percentage that's been vaccinated is pretty large among states. The graph on the right is the daily doses administered per 100 people. So you can see, this, of course, is the same as it was last month. It went up, and in April it peaked, and then it went way down, and in early July it was kind of at a minimum. But as the pandemic has gone on, as perhaps education has increased, the daily vaccination doses have increased as well. It's recovering to not quite to half where it was, say, in August now, as it was declining from July. The range, last month there was about a 9 to 1 range. When you look at the states that were given the most doses per 100 people to the least, that's narrowed to about 6 to 1. Still a pretty big range, but less than last month. And where we are right now is 71% of the population has received at least one dose, and about 60% of the population is fully vaccinated. This rose, the elderly number rose to now more than 99%. of those 65 and older have received at least one dose, and 86% are fully vaccinated. And those are CDC data. All this is CDC data, except the graph of daily doses is from Our World in Data.
When you say 71% of the U.S. population, does that include infants?
Yeah, it's 70% of the total population.
Wow.
So it's not just that, it's larger if you just look at those eligible. Yeah. I'll show some more data with a little more breakdown of that from Santa Barbara here in just a couple slides. This is this graph I've showed for the last 3 months since the health department started putting it out. I think it's a really good graph to show around. It's the case rate per 100,000 for the vaccinated and unvaccinated populations in Santa Barbara County. So, and it's remained pretty steadily about 4x, so about 4 times as many new cases per 100,000 amongst the unvaccinated population compared to the vaccinated population. So we all hear and understand, I think, that the immunity that we may have gotten from being vaccinated early in the campaign to get vaccinated at the beginning of the year may be waning now. But even at the, in the last time slice in these data, that gap has not begun to shrink yet. It's still 4x as it's been pretty consistently over the last 6 months or so. But makes a big difference to be vaccinated. Certainly, all these blue people that were vaccinated didn't expect necessarily to become a case of COVID, but that the odds of that happening are a lot lower if you're vaccinated. This is the monthly data for a number of vaccinations, and you can see this looks, not dissimilar to the U.S. data. Shot way up and it peaked in April, and then it went down pretty steeply, bottomed in July, but then has been increasing since then as the pandemic has gone on and as booster shots come, right? Those go into the daily doses being administered. It's gotten up to about 600 doses a day in November for Santa Barbara County. 70% of our population here is vaccinated, and that's about 3% more than in November. 62% is fully vaccinated, so 2 doses at least, which is about 2% more than in November. Of the eligible, which kind of goes to the question, so people who actually could be candidates to get a vaccine, about 74% of them have been vaccinated, and that's down 5% because we had a bunch of new population become eligible when the vaccine was approved for use in children. So now this 5 to 11 demographic is now eligible, and they're just starting to get vaccinated now. So that actually went down about 5%. The same thing for the fully vaccinated population. And the other thing that the health department did for reasons they didn't mention was there used to be a category for 75 plus, and it's gone now. So the oldest data I have are for 65 to 74 for the most current month. But you can see the percent vaccinated goes down with age. And get to the recently eligible kids here, these that have been eligible for a while, there's a decreasing degree of vaccination with age. At least last month when the 75 plus data were there, pretty much from 65 and up at a very similar profile in terms of the degree of vaccination. So overall comments. For the current outbreaks for the globe, the models, the sum of the country's models estimates about 300 million cases and about 6 million deaths, which is a 2% case fatality risk, which is really about where it is right now. The case forecast is up about 10% from last month when it was 270 million, and the death forecast is the same. So, and again, as I always say, that assumes that the current state of outbreaks resolves kind of on a normal trajectory of these outbreaks and no new outbreaks develop, but that doesn't really happen that way, but that would be the prediction. So, I look at it as kind of the minimum. If the pandemic really drew to a reasonable mathematical conclusion somehow from here on in, that's how many we'd have. And as I've mentioned a couple times, and it's a little bit more sort of qualitative than I usually talk about, but it's just remarkable how at the country, state, and county level, so many of the outbreaks have seen this arresting of the decline of new cases to becoming stagnant or just turning up a little bit, and the leveling and growth that's being observed so broadly, not dramatic rocketing up like we're seeing in some places in Europe, but just a lot of places outside of Europe where it's just no longer coming down and it's stopped or starting to go up a little bit. So we're seeing that in the U.S. We're seeing that even in Santa Barbara County. Seems like it is going to be the kind of condition you need to sustain the continued growth in global daily new cases. So my expectation would be that as we go towards the end of the year and into January, we're going to continue to see growth in daily new cases because we're seeing the beginnings of that so broadly across many of these outbreaks. The case fatality risk hasn't changed significantly. In the next month or two, I'll do a more detailed analysis like I do a couple times a year just to see if there's any trend to learn there. Anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them.
Where can I go on vacation?
China.
Okay, thank you.
Or Africa. Just look for the green.
How the booster vaccines fit into it. So do you know what people who are eligible for boosters do have the boosters?
I haven't found data that lets me tease that out in terms of how much are people embracing the boosters. My suspicion is that some portion, and maybe a significant portion of the doses being administered each day and the way that's grown in the last couple of months is represented by boosters. But I haven't seen a split how many those are.
Another question is more just a family type thing. I have family members that are going to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Now, those are little tiny places. I don't know if you have any data on those places.
Yeah, if you could zoom in, Puerto Rico would be red. I believe both the Dominican Republic and Haiti are yellow, which means they're below the median global level of transmission new cases, but not green. So, in their lower levels of community transmission than in the US and in Europe, but higher than my recommendations to Don of going to China or Africa that are green.
I would expect the immunization rate in Haiti is really low, but I would think that.
Yeah, I don't think I have that on that immunization chart, but if you wanted to check it, as I always do, the website Our World in Data is great. They just collect data and they have an interface that lets you graph it and pick some countries and format it. In my experience, is a pretty reliable source of data.
Do you have any information on the VARS database and vaccine injuries and how that's happening percent and stuff like that? Do you have any graphs on that? Are you following that?
I'm not following that. I'm reporting to it. When I got my booster a couple of weeks ago, I get the text every day from the CDC to report that, but I haven't been looking at that. I did. I guess the closest thing I came to looking at that was when somebody pointed me to a website that was like the 14 reasons I'm not getting my kid vaccinated or something. And I started to dig into, well, what are these reasons and do they make sense and how much? And there were some pretty crazy numbers being asserted about thousands of people dying from the vaccine based on VARS data. And I made a half-hearted attempt to try and actually get to the data, and I wasn't successful in really finding something I thought was reliable. So I'm not sure how. I don't. So it's a long way to say I haven't really looked at it, and I haven't found a way to get data that I put together and show to people because I was confident it was accurate.
But what's the reason for that? Is the VARS database just very obtuse, or I mean, what was the? I thought it was ages and all kinds of stuff. Data was there, and it's all public. What was their problem?
Yeah, I didn't find a public way to get at the data. I just found summaries of the data from people that, in my opinion, had a point to make. So since I didn't, and again, I didn't work on it a lot, but I didn't find a way to just get the data from the CDC. And I didn't want to get the secondhand data from people that were processing it and making inferences.
No, you want to get it directly from CDC. I just was surprised that you weren't able to.
Yeah.
I guess the one catch is it's not really CDC data. It's whatever anybody posts.
Yeah, that's true.
There's no investigation of it. There's no verification. You could post that your transmission failed and it would show up there as far as I know.
Actually, I've had doctors say that when they put a report in, they get a call back from the CDC to verify it, and they asked a bunch of questions. There is some verification.
Jennifer has posted the VAERS IP address and said that anybody can post anything they want to post. Yeah, and Jennifer works for California Department of Public Health, so I would think she'd be reliable in that.
Oh, yeah, but then they have to check. I was understanding they checked it out, but maybe they don't. Maybe I'm wrong. But that would be true for any vaccine, not just COVID. Any vaccine, anybody can post whatever. And so you can kind of compare how other vaccines are doing compared to this vaccine with the same degree of possible flaw.
Yeah, I think its value is to send up a flag for someone to do a more detailed study where they control the data more. I think that's typically been the value of the VAERS system, is it provides, I say, food for thought for an epidemiologist who really wants to study something. If he sees something that's popping up there, then he might start doing a more controlled study of it. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, the concern I had was that things that have been put out was that there are more deaths from COVID vaccine than all other vaccines combined for 30 years. And I'm going, if that's true, that's a lot. Even if you say there's some flaws in the data, that would have to be some pretty big flaws for that not to be significant unless somebody's gaming the system, which I kind of doubt. And so it's a shame that Dave wasn't able to get in there, because I would really trust Dave's analysis compared to someone else trying to make a point.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a look at that. I think part of me thinks, man, I don't know how many deaths there have been from other kinds of vaccines.
It's all in the database.
Yeah. But I'll take a look at that for next time or two.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it, because I trust you a lot more than anybody else.
No, thanks.
The trouble is, when people report things, it's sometimes crazy. I had a patient when I was in Baltimore, got a flu shot, walked out of the street and got hit by lightning. And of course, the flu shot was the reason for it, and so that kind of data is in there.
Yes, but that's in there for all the other vaccines too. So if you compare apples with apples, and if it is true that 30 years worth of deaths from all the flu vaccines, all the tetanus vaccines, all the measles vaccines, the deaths from that are less than the deaths from the COVID in the last year and a half, that would be significant. And unless somebody's out there doing out fake ballots, so to speak, which is possible. But
now that vaccine has become a political issue, it's hard to compare it against 30-year-old data.
But I've heard VAERS database, I've heard 6,000 to 17,000. Which again, percentage-wise isn't, but then again, compared to other stuff, all the stuff that's said negative about vaccines in the past, and what's happened to other vaccines, how many did it take before they pulled them off the market?
Well, how many diseases do they prevent versus how many do they cause? So you got
that's why I'd really like Dave to look at it, because he's the one that could figure that out.
Well, you've piqued my interest, so I'll do some digging. Or maybe the pandemic will end before I get a chance. What do you think?
Not too much time.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, good conversation. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much every time. Appreciate it.